Okay, so today we're looking at qualitative research. So as you may or may not know, in some disciplines, there is a focus on the quantitative research. Certainly the natural sciences and computing. Even psychology tends to focus more on, like, in fact, psychology tends to focus on both quantitative, qualitative, and mixed methods. And then the humanities, so the humanities and social sciences tend to focus towards qualitative and the natural sciences towards quantitative. And then disciplines that sort of are, I call it even in between. The computing is sort of in between as to depending on which part of computing. So information systems is probably more focused towards mixed methods depending on the research you're doing, whereas the computer science tends to be more quantitative. Anyway, so the long and the short is good researchers need to know about qualitative research. Before we go into this, I'm going to recommend to everybody that if you are thinking of doing a major project that is qualitative only, be sure that your supervisor is a expert or very knowledgeable on qualitative, because there's such a bias against qualitative only projects in this school that you may be at a disadvantage, both in terms of the quality of your supervisor and in terms of how the panel judges you. But that doesn't mean that qualitative research is not important. It's very important, but I'm just giving you a tip based on my experience. So there are a number of things that we want to do today. I'm not going to read that list. So based on this slide, there are 5 steps. Now, depending on what textbook you're reading, there could be other steps. But usually in data collection, if it involves people, you want to figure out what is your population, what percentage of the population you're going to look at. Those are called the participants. Where are you going to go? How are you going to gain access? You need to figure out what types of information you're going to get to answer your research question. So for every research question, you need to make sure you get information for all of the research questions. You need to design instruments that are going to, so remember, instrument includes a set of interview questions, the instrument. Or if you're doing observations, the steps that you take in the observations is also an instrument. And then you're going to administer the data collection itself. So who's going to be studied? You either do it in a random way, which is quantitative typically, or you do it in a purposefully way so you can understand the phenomenon. In general, you are looking to understand the phenomenon when there is less known about the study. So it's usually qualitative projects are more exploratory, and quantitative projects tend to be more testing hypotheses. So that's why it says up here in the top of the slide, you want to generalize from the sample to the population, to make claims about the population, and to build theories that explain the population. And so typically you take large samples in order to make those generalizations. In contrast, in qualitative, you're trying to understand what is going on, so you can that understanding will be useful. You learn about the phenomenon, and you're giving voice to silenced people if there are certain people who normally are not researched. There are many different ways of purposeful sampling, and we don't need to understand all of them today, just looking at an overview. If you're going to do a qualitative project, you may actually want to come back to this slide and look at it in some greater depth. But the point is, it depends. Now, if you remember all the way back to the first 2 or 3 weeks in the semester, you would have focused on the research question. I'll go back here. And if you're going to focus on the research question, we said that research question, if you remember, is the most important part of your concept note. Because what is the research about? It's about answering research questions. You come up with methods that is to answer those research questions, and at the end of your project, you have a conclusion that is the answer to the research question. Now, I'll go back to this, back to where we are. So in a quantitative project, you come up with research questions or hypotheses, and then you collect the data based on the methods However, in qualitative, it actually depends. So sometimes you know exactly what you intend to do and you never change research question. But sometimes, based on the qualitative project, you actually may go and change research question after you start data collection. It's really different than quantitative. So so we have these two questions. What is the intent? So if the intent of the project is to develop many perspectives to describe what is typical, so there are all these different intents. So what is the intent before and what is the intent after? Depending what's the intent, there are all these ways to do sampling, right? So if you remember, we've already talked about snowball sampling, where you were trying to, it's hard to find people, so somebody who answers your question, you say, do you know anybody else or another place that would be a thing? And they point you there. If your data has started, you have started and you realize that, oh, this is not what I expected. And so you change how you're doing the sampling. If you are doing the sampling and you realize that this is definitely not what you expected, you may change the sampling technique. So this is basically these approaches is based on the data collection, you change your methods. All of this now is what you intended from the beginning. So did you plan to develop many perspectives? If so, let's take social media. So let's say you're doing a study on social media. If what you want to find out is what are all the people on social media doing, you need to interview, or maybe not interview, whatever the qualitative way you're going to get the information from. You need elderly people. You need children who are even below 13 who are not supposed to be on social media. Not true? You need teenagers. You need people in poor rural communities. You need urban rich people. You need people of every single different age group. You get to me? So whether it's rich, poor, rural, urban, age group, race, whatever it is, you need many if that's what you really want. Not true? However, instead, let's say you just wanted to know about teenagers in urban areas in Jamaica. Then you just go to Montego Bay and Jamaica. You may only want Montego Bay and Kingston, Jamaica, and find out what the adolescents in those two areas are looking at on social media, which might be actually different than what's happening in the rural communities. Which is different than typical sampling, which is different than extreme cases, So all of these is like, it depends on the what you're trying to get from your project. If you're trying to figure out a theory, so like, for example, I have an interest in figuring out what will lead to, I want to use computer mediated technology to increase physical activity among everybody. So if I want to figure out a theory that's going to work, I may do a number of things to find out what interests people, and my sampling there might be very different than something else, just to see what people are using it. The point is, this is all different depending on your project, and to figure out what works, it's also, you need to read the literature to see how people have done it in the past. And moving on from that, in general, in qualitative projects, you want to, it's because it takes a lot of time to do qualitative projects, whether it is interviews or focus groups or observations or any other kind of records, because sometimes you take records that are in an organization and then basically read through them in depth, or any kind of other database with qualitative data. Typically, you start with this idea that you're going for 30. That tends to be the rule of thumb. However, there's this concept that you're looking for themes until you find what is called saturation, right? And that saturation could be reached way before the number 30 is reached. So if, for example, you are back to my social media youth, that I'm interviewing youth in Jamaica, in Kingston and Montego Bay, and I find that I go to 20 people and 19 also 20 of them for every question I'm asking saying the same thing. I could say I've reached saturation. By the way, I'm not a qualitative expert, but the point is I may not need to go to 30 because it's so obvious that at least in the population I'm looking at, there's not it's a homogeneous group and there's not much variation. Perhaps there's no need to continue because basically we're finding the same thing from all of the participants. Just like in all research, you need permission. So in the US, it's called the Institutional Review Board. In the UK, Jamaica, etc., it's called the Research Ethics Committee. So we have a Research Ethics Committee at UTech. And then in addition to that permission, you also need permission from the place where you're going. It's called the gatekeepers. So maybe the people in charge usually write a letter after you get the ethics permission, and as well as talk to the people, obviously, to say, can I do research there? And then you, in addition to the gatekeepers, people in charge, you also need to ask each person who is involved in research. And that is normally called, which is did that presentation already. You have a letter to the participant and the informed consent form. So there actually are differences between the qualitative and quantitative permissions. So usually go in person. So when you go in person, typically you may actually call in advance or get a heads up, but you're not going to get the real permission usually until you're actually there. And then you're going to do interviewing or observations. Those are the two most typical types of qualitative. But focus groups, which is group interviewing, is also useful. Qualitative is definitely personal, not centered on variables, but you need to be measuring something. So the research question should have at least one variable, but the way you're measuring it is non-numeric. You can use cameras and other recorders, but that almost must be with permission. And you do that so you can get a transcription, as in a verbatim recording of what happened. So when you want to write to the gatekeeper, you want to tell them why you chose a site, what you're going to need from them, as in like, time is going to take approximately, what you hope to accomplish, what's the purpose of doing the project, how likely it is going to be disruptive, what will the individuals gain from the study, and how they will use and report the results. So these are the typical things that you get from a qualitative study: observations, interviews, documents, and AV material. So we'll go through all of them in turn. So for observations, the observation is the process of gathering first-hand information by observing people and places at a research site. So you have the participant and non-participant observer. So if you are the non-participant, okay, the thing about it, if you become part of a community, like there's a way to do an observation where you're there over many days or weeks or months. The longer you're there, people are not going to remember that you are an observer. But apart from reducing the likelihood that people remember you are an observer, is that if you get involved in the setting, then you're a participant observer. If you are just observing from the outside, you're a non-participant observer. And both of them have their pros and cons, and it really depends on the purpose of your project as to what you're going to do. So in observing, after you get the permissions, no matter what, you're going to not just rush in doing the observation. You need to figure out who you're observing, when to observe, how long to observe, so that you won't make people uncomfortable where possible. In order to conduct multiple observations, you need to understand the site, especially if it's a kind of situation that you're not used to, or they're not used to you, and you need to take notes. So there usually is a clear set of procedures that your research team or you as a single researcher have created to record what is relevant to your research question. So you're going to take notes, depending on what the research is about, about the event, activities, and people. And it's critical not just to take facts, it's also normally expected for you to reflect on anything that you see that is interesting, so insights, hunches, broad themes, and then you walk away. Typically, you don't thank people in an observation, as opposed to interviews, focus groups, even back to the other stuff that's here. Documents, all of these you would put in observations. You're only thanking the gatekeeper, not normally the people that you're observing, because it's the nature of the observations. In interviews, there can be one-on-one or group, which could be by phone, email, or obviously face-to-face. I'm not sure why face-to-face is not there. So interviews can be structured, semi-structured, or unstructured. They're all generally open-ended, even the structured ones. And the idea is to create options for responding from people. And then you record it, whether only handwritten notes or preferably, like with some kind of technology so that you can transcribe it for analysis. You want to identify who you're going to interview, decide the type of interview, depending on the context, take notes. In that interview, especially if it's a group interview, you need at least a second person, but even a one-on-one, it's good to have a second person if possible. And it should be in a quiet place. Obviously, you need to inform the consent from the interviewee. Anybody remember the difference between consent and informed consent? This only says consent, but you really should get informed consent. I'm talking to people who are here. In chat. That's not the answer. I said, does anybody remember? So consent just means that you you agree. Informed consent means that you understand the risks and the advantage of being part of the study. So like when I gave the lecture on research ethics earlier and I went through 3 negative examples, in all of those, I think all of them, in all of them, people didn't have consent. And even the one that I talked about, the Facebook, if you remember, if you were there for the lecture, even the Facebook study, there was consent, but not informed consent, because people did not read. And in a sense, you could sort of, maybe you could say, well, maybe they're at fault. But the point is, in a sense, it's a little bit ridiculous to expect people to expect when they're pressing click that they're going to be possibly changing your mood. Really, I think it's actually unreasonable personally. I think that that's the kind of thing that there should have been some information, and then many months later that it happened, something. I think that there was a way that they could have actually done informed consent, but that's just my take on it. Anyway, during the interview, you must have a plan. That's the idea. And you can use probes to get as much information as possible. So when somebody answers a question, if they don't give enough information, you say, what, you basically, you prompt or probe them to get more information. In the whole thing, you should always be professional. So in general, there's this idea that in quantitative projects, you have structured and semi-structured, but really at the end of it, I would say it's fluid. And in all projects, you're going to have written interview questions that you can make notes on. So I presume, maybe I shouldn't presume anything. I'm going to, no, let me not assume. So a structured interview is one where you have a set of specific questions with finite answers. So like, here's an interview question. Let me see, so that's a nice one. What is your year at UTech? In fact, I want to call it level. So you guys don't know it's level. What's your year at UTech? And I say year 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And by the way, I'm ending at 7 because UTech only allows 4 plus 3. So after year 7, you are supposed to be kicked out unless you get some. So maybe I put other. So I think there are 1 or 2 students that UTech actually allows after year 7, but typically after year 7, you're out. Right? So that I could start the interview by asking some structured questions like that. That gives us some finite answers. A completely unstructured question would be something like, uh, what do you feel about technology at UTech? And I'm not asking right now. And I can imagine the interesting responses that I already know what the answers are from most of you there. Not true, guys? And a semi-structured interview for UTech could be something like, it really is. So back to the question, it's a semi-structured question. There's no question of semi-structured. The interview that has a combination of structured and unstructured questions is semi-structured. So you could decide, depending on particular answer, you ask different questions. You could go it partly flow, but questionnaires are designed differently depending on what makes sense for the particular project. So for documents, you're going to have, but okay, it depends on the project. If there are existing documents that can help to answer the research questions, they could be used. So for example, I can think of an example where a colleague at UTech was doing a research project looking at, I was an engineering colleague, was a lecturer, was looking at the relationship between the students' academic performance. And I'm trying to remember what it was. Something, I don't even remember what, but some characters of the students. And so they gave in an ethics form to basically be able to pull the academic records of students. And by the way, that was delisted. So it was just with the ID, so it could be linked to some history of their engineering files. Not to forget the people's name, just to look at, like, so basically look at the patterns to see if you could figure out what were the things that led to. I'm trying to remember all the things what they were trying to look for. Maybe it was academic performance as well as dropout rates, but they were trying to look at things in order to see how they could help students. So it was a research not for wasting time, it was trying to do things so eventually help students who do it. But they had to ask for real documents for the research. And so, and by the way, that particular research project did not ask the students for two reasons. One, it's actually was only done within UTech, and the information was not going to go to anybody publicly. And it didn't have the students' names as part of it. It only used the ID because it was tying to some of the history, and it was only used within UTech, and so there was no need for that. But the point is, it still had to go through the formal ethics process before it went to the records department, because the committee had to look to see, was this research well designed? Was it actually worth doing all of that? So it's sometimes useful to get public or private records, but all of those times you actually have to go through the ethics procedure to get it. If it's done properly, I should add. Usually documents are good for text data if they are well properly taken notes. Obviously you need permissions, and it's good to scan. If it's manual documents, scan them before using them so they don't get lost. For all the visual materials, you're going to determine if there's any material that can help with your research questions, determine if those, if obviously always you need permission, checking whether it's accurate, because if it's not, there's, research answers to research questions are only going to be as good as the quality of the data. And then you're going to need to analyze the data in order to see if there's anything useful. So in all data collection, there's going to be rules, in other words, protocols. So in order to have those rules, you need to have forms. So the forms designed need to tell you exactly what to be done. What are the instructions for the research? Are there probes? There's a note page for the interview. Similarly for the protocols, you have forms designed to do that as well. So the interview protocol is going to include a header, icebreaker, major questions that address major project research questions, probes that clarify and elaborate, and then there's space. So here's, oh, it's not there. So there's not an example on my screen. And then for observations, you're going to have a paper where you're going to also put the time, place, setting, the name of the person doing the observation, and your role. And then you're going to have a left column On the right column, the left column, we talk about the facts. And then the right column, we talk about themes, quotes, personal experiences, and you normally draw a sketch of the site. And then there are field issues. So you need to make sure that you have enough time to get there, time for data collection, enough time to do the observations or the interviews, so you can get a database that's going to, be able to answer the research question in a way that it is robust. If you're an observer, you need to be trained and know how to, conduct yourself in a way that is professional and appropriate. Where possible, you need rapport with the participants. Like I just went through, I don't know why, but I go through being a participant research so many times. So in the last, except for students. So when most students, by the way, when most of you come to me, I tell you no. You know why? So students come to me and they show me a questionnaire. I start to show them, but this questionnaire is poorly designed. And when it's in paper, they say, but it printed already. I said, but I can't see this mistake, that mistake. I said, no, go and fix it. Oh, it's too late. I'm like, I don't know how doing it. But once the research is properly designed, I'm willing to bear a part. So I was just involved in a sort of, I was a semi-structured interview the other day. A family member has dementia, and so I was being asked questions about my experience of that. I've been in studies, another big study is the National Lifestyle Survey, where they took both medical, like blood work and blood pressure and weight. Gave me a what do you call this again? Gave me a whole lot of questions on a questionnaire, as well as gave me a tracker so they could see how much physical activity I did for a week. It was a very comprehensive study on everybody's lifestyle who was part of it. But in that, what I did notice is it's very different how much rapport you have. So that lady who just did it recently, she built really good rapport with me. So by the end, I was just enjoying the process. When I did the lifestyle survey, I didn't particularly build such good rapport. And so I was looking at these people who are much younger than me and actually asked them, is there a supervisor? Because some of the questions were uncomfortable. And they started to tell me they're trained in ethics. I said, I don't know about that. So participant rapport is so key if you're doing qualitative projects, because if the people feel uncomfortable, they'll run you. It's taking too long and they don't even tell you that. They might even take it too long and just say they can't bother anymore, which is their right. So it's all about making the people feel, if possible, good about being a part of your study. We said this already, so I don't need to say it again. You need to obtain permission. I said that before. So there are a number of ethical issues. You need to inform people of the purpose of your study. Don't deceive. I did say when we talked about ethics that there are some examples where deception could be practiced, but all of those times has to be you gotten previous permission from an ethics committee, and those are rare. You share your, as in, that's only when the project can only be done with that temporary deception. So if you're trying to figure out if people who eat on red plates eat more than people who eat blue plates, by the way, red plates make you eat more than people when you eat with blue plates. Similar, big plates make you eat more than little plates, in case you don't know. They actually do those research studies. They ask me why I do this research, and they never tell people until afterwards that was what the study was about. So they said the study was about something else, and then they said, oh, they're giving them some free food while they're waiting. And then afterwards they say, oh, by the way, we finished the study, and the study was really about your eating and how yeah. So that's deception, but it's not the end of the world. Deception, they always tell them afterwards. So there are studies like that deception is considered okay, but it must be with good reason. So you should always share your role as a researcher. You'd be respectful of where you are. If possible, you give back either in kind or at least being nice. If possible, if it's a research study that can actually benefit the participants or their family, it should be done. So for example, if it's a pharmaceutical company, which this is not research, this is not what you're going to do for a living. But if it was a pharmaceutical company and the medicine that is being researched could be used to help the people in the study, that should be part of the plan. You should always use good interviewing practices, maintain confidentiality by telling nobody about what happened in the observations, interviews, focus groups, data, any other kind of data collection, document. None of that should be shared outside of the study. All the information, you should never record the people's names. It should always be like person X or something. So for example, I just listened to a presentation about less than a week ago, and somebody was saying like Mrs. John. And then people at the end were saying, but how could you have the person's name? And they're saying, no, those were fake names. But instead of using like real names, it's better even when you're presenting it to say person X or like participant 2, because that way everybody's knowing that's not the name of the person. So for sure, you should both maintain confidentiality and everybody knows for sure you're doing it because you're not using real names. And collaborating the participants is really unusual, but if the participants want a summary of the research, like me, the lady who just did, she's doing her PhD, and I told her I definitely want a summary of this study, and she told me she's going to invite me to her PhD defense, and I actually want to go. So I'm like, yeah, that sounds cool. I could have wanted the abstract, but I actually prefer going to the defense. So once I'm not busy, I'll go to her defense, or if not, I'll just get the abstract because that's what I want. So, I mean, I can't get any other benefit from the study, but at least I can get that. So, yeah. So I'm going to stop share here. So I'm a bit early.